Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for September 19th, 2023. By now, I'm sure that most of our regular viewers are well aware that we're in the midst of a global transformation, not the one demanded by the World Economic Forum, the so-called Great Reset, which would be on behalf of the global corporate cartels and their intent to establish a central banker dictatorship over the world economy. That's been rejected by most of the world as should be obvious. But instead, we're seeing a tectonic shift away from the unipolar order towards something which can become a new paradigm, as called by the Schiller Institute's Helga Zepp-LaRouche, a new strategic and development architecture. This was outlined, the method to achieve this was outlined by her in a document, The 10 Principles of a New International Security and Development Architecture, which will be linked in the description page. And it's in this document that she lays out a map for the kind of discussion that's necessary to move away from the brink of war, which is we're headed to based on the attempt to sustain a unipolar order, to move away from that to an era of mutual benefit for all nations, all sovereign nations. Now, to replace this neocolonial IMF system, we've seen a whole series of events recently, some of which are called an order that's a multipolar order, but we prefer the idea of a cooperative order for mutual benefit that is based on multilateral agreements and not blocks or geopolitical formations insisting on their way or the highway. As the UN General Assembly opens today in New York City, this shift will be the central focus of the discussion. And what's at the key of this is the emergence of the global South as a factor. This includes the BRICS. We had the BRICS summit several weeks ago in which the plan was developed for a new development bank for incorporating more of the world's poorer nations into a development perspective, funded fully by credit, including national currencies outside of the control of the City of London and Wall Street. This was on display again in the fight that went on at the Group of 20 meeting in India, where there was an effort by the G7 countries to condemn Russia and insist on more tight controls for the so-called climate change. But those were rejected by the majority of the nations that now make up the Group of 20. There was the G77 meeting, and then there was the Vladivostok Eastern Economic Forum. What has become clear is that the so-called Global South will no longer accept the dictates of the international financial cartels or the raw material cartels. They'll no longer tolerate any form of neocolonialism. Now, even the perennial sophist, Antony Blinken, the U.S. Secretary of State, seems to be getting the message. He had this to say in a speech the other day, quote, "What we are experiencing now is more than a test for the durability of the world order created after the Cold War. It is the end of this order." Now, does he really mean that? Remember, he's the leading salesman for the unipolar order. He's at the center of a team of intelligence and diplomatic corps in the State Department, in the security services of the United States, who are committed to continuing the post-Cold War unipolar order, in which the United States is the sole superpower, and with its allies, especially the British, but also NATO, can use military power to enforce the continuation of that order. But Blinken has been the target of a series of dressing downs, including one from South Africa's Foreign Minister Naledi Pandor, who basically said to the arrogant Blinken, "Don't come here lecturing us. We are a sovereign nation." Now, being that Blinken is a sophist, that is, has no commitment to truth or fairness, I don't think he's prepared to accept the inevitable. And he and his gang are going to continue to support the proxy war in Ukraine against Russia as one of the means of destabilizing the emergence of this new coalition, global coalition. Zelensky, for example, is going to be addressing the United Nations tomorrow. And he's obviously going to call for more arms, more support, more money, and rant and rave about the barbaric Russians, even while he's sending growing numbers of Ukrainian citizens to their deaths in a meat grinder war that has nothing to do with Ukraine's economic independence or freedom, and has everything to do with the intent to preserve the unipolar order by weakening Russia. In that context, the Ukraine Contact Group will be meeting in Ramstein Air Force Base again today. It was at this meeting 2 years ago where Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense from Raytheon, called for a weakening of Russia so that Russia will not be able to wage war, and has continued that call, which has largely led to a flow of huge amounts of money into the military-industrial complex in the United States, the flow of weapons into black markets, and the enrichment of Zelensky and his cronies. Interesting, going into the UN meeting, Zelensky's new defense secretary just fired 6 top deputies of the Defense Department. Remains to be seen what this represents, but I don't really think it's going to go after the corruption that we've seen, especially when you have companies like BlackRock lurking to take over all of Ukraine's resources that they can grab. Now, at the contact group meeting, it's probable that long-range weapons will be offered for the attempt to retake Crimea. But at what expense? How many more people will die for this? Then we have the case of Blinken's sidekick, the pathetic foreign minister of Germany, the Green leader Annalena Baerbock, who just toured the US and told Fox News that Ukraine must win. And what she said is, what signal does it send to the other dictators like Xi Jinping if Ukraine loses? This is diplomacy? China called in the German ambassador in Beijing to file an official protest against her characterization of Xi as a dictator. But speaking of dictators, remember it was Baerbock who famously said that Germany will continue supporting Ukraine in the war, quote, no matter what my German voters think, unquote. That's democracy? And keep in mind, the German voters are now showing in the polls that the Green Party of Baerbock is down to 17% and falling of support. So how can they stop the tide of this emergence of the global South besides war and economic blackmail? Well, one thing they may try to do is change the structure of the UN Security Council so that they can now force through resolutions without worrying about a veto from Russia or China or the other non-permanent members. But the proverbial horse has already left the barn. And an example of that was the Eastern Economic Forum in Vladivostok. Russia is not isolated. It's the global north that's isolated. There was almost no one there from the transatlantic countries. There were representatives from all of the global south. India, China was represented. And they mapped out policies to expand trade, investment, infrastructure, transport corridors, and financing outside of the control of Wall Street and the City of London. They have on the books 2,800 planned projects, 646 of which are already underway. Putin talked about Russia's investment in the Far East and opening that up for exploitation of raw materials, oil and gas. Only 1/3 of that vast territory has already been explored. There's a development of a Siberian pipeline, which will triple the production of liquefied natural gas by 2030. Lyndon LaRouche, in the book The Earth's Next 50 Years, spoke about the 21st century as an Asian century. And he has a chapter in there called The Coming Eurasian World. Now, what he spoke about was not something for the benefit only of Asians, but how the investment and participation of the rest of the world can benefit all of humanity. That's the win-win approach that the Schiller Institute has always taken. That's what the Belt and Road Initiative represents. And that's what the emergence of these new institutions, such as the BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and others, is fighting for. The question is, will the global North participate? Not in the form of Obama's exclusive pivot to Asia, which is based on benefiting the Western corporate cartels and expanding NATO into Asia to contain China, but based on new principles of economic development for mutual benefit. So join with us, the Schiller Institute and the LaRouche Organization, to change the policies in the transatlantic countries. You can't rely on a Blinken or a Biden to do that. We need a solid minority of outspoken citizens in the global North, the West, transatlantic, whatever you want to call it, to step forward and join with the global South in rejecting the new neocolonialism based on neoliberal central bank dictatorship policies. So I'll be back again tomorrow. In the meantime, read through Helga Zepp-LaRouche's 10 principles and think about how that represents a fundamental shift in world politics.